I've been asked to look at some of the work that we do around natural resources, by which I'll be using that term loosely, but food, metals, energy, and other natural resources like those. The impact of rising consumption, particularly in emerging economies, a large part of which is obviously due to the middle classes, but not only, and the impact that is having on the world, which is a very big subject, and I'll be whistling through it very shortly. But hopefully towards the end, I can come back to some of the questions which are pertinent regarding emerging economies and the middle classes there. I think the general state of the psychology around this is that people tend to, I think in the West, have quite a fear of what is going on. So it's almost the opposite. People are very comfortable with middle classes in Europe. But when we think about the middle classes in Asia or somewhere else, it's often as the driver of some kind of fearsome growth monster that's going to knock us over. So hopefully I'll put some qualifiers around that. But I'm not sure it's going to be a terribly positive story, because there's quite a lot of scary stuff in here. This is what's been happening to the trade in global resources over the last 10 years. The grey lines, the inner lines on each flow, are where we were 10 years ago, and the coloured lines show the increase, expansion in exports from different parts of the world. The rest of my presentation will give examples which show what we're talking about, but it just gives you a bit of a snapshot of the dramatic state of growth across all kinds of resources markets. And it's the emerging economies who are responsible for almost all of the growth in resource consumption over the past 10 years, in nearly every category. Now, these are 5 of the key countries. China at the bottom, by far the largest in terms of its resource consumption and its growth. And then India, Brazil, Russia and South Africa are all playing a prominent role. One of the important points to note is that while they're consuming all these resources to build cities and industries, as I'll explain in a moment, a large part of that is actually in order to produce goods that we're consuming over here. So this is part of a global story, not disconnected from it. Because I'm in the Royal Geographical Society, I thought I should have a few maps. And this is just one example. This is an example of metals. I've just added all the metals together, and this is what's happened over the last 10 years in that. Just gives you a sense of the change in resources trade between countries. And the reason I show this is just to I think it gives a bit of a snapshot of how the politics is changing between different countries in the world. So with emerging economies at the centre and large parts of the world really reorienting their trade towards the growth in those countries. Now, the reason everyone is talking about this, or one of the reasons, is that even today it feels like our resources systems are quite stressed and the impact on the environment is quite serious. But if we look to the future, I think in the previous presentations it was made clear that we're expecting several more billion people to join the middle classes certainly in the next 20 years. And one of the consequences of that is massive increase in resource consumption again. So that applies whether you're talking about energy or food or metals, or in particular in water. And I have a couple of examples of that in a moment. So if we're going to meet all of that additional consumption, first of all, we need a lot of money to be invested in those things. Hopefully, we need that to be invested in such a way which isn't going to cause environmental destruction, which is going to be particularly difficult. And also, we need governments not to be causing fights over it, which actually is a lot of the work that we do is around the politics of these questions. So the rest of my presentation is going to very quickly run through these 4 points against that background. So firstly, I'm just going to point out the obvious, which I suppose is the politics of resources is really, it's very near and present because of the prices. That's why governments and other people are thinking about it. I'm going to comment on some of the environmental changes which could disrupt resources, but also are potentially caused by the growth in resources. And then I'm going to come back to the main theme, essentially, which is that the growth in resource consumption is really closely tied to urbanisation and also to the growth of urban middle classes in particular in the emerging economies. Although, as I mentioned, that's where all the growth is coming from, but actually they remain poor and generally they're still consuming less than we are. And then finally, to make the point that actually those countries are the countries that face the most serious challenges associated with those resource consumption issues. So we'll all suffer from climate change, which they contribute to like we do, but actually the immediate impacts are at home. So this is just to give you the big number, which is that resource prices climbed dramatically a few years ago, and they've stayed there. So not only a dramatic increase in prices across a range of resources, also those prices are moving together more. So the prices for metals, food, and fuels, energy, tend to be moving in the same direction these days. But also, in the last few years, we've had enormous swings, and that's why it's often been on the news. Obviously, it's an extremely sensitive issue for governments. When prices increase, it hurts the poorest. Arguably, the middle classes squeal loudest, and also corporate players respond. One of the reasons that prices are high is that it costs more to get stuff out the ground, and we're all consuming more. There's a lot of pressure on the global system in terms of producing resources. One of the more worrying aspects of that is the availability of water. So if you're talking about agriculture, some of the most water-stressed areas in the world are where we produce a lot of our food, whether that's in parts of India or China or even in the west coast of the United States. So any disruption to or further use of water, and we know we're going to need a lot more, could affect agricultural production. At the same time, we're going to be using a lot more resource consumption for metals production, for energy-related industries and so on. And all of those will be competing with cities where everybody is moving in order to benefit from the economic growth there. So this is how the story is starting to join together. At the same time, this is really a story of globalization, of course, and this is some of the physical aspects of the risks which we're facing. This shows the density of shipping routes in the last, in a single year a few years ago, and what it highlights is that a few major hubs around the world are responsible for an enormous share of global resource flows. So this growth in the emerging economies, fed by production in key producing regions in the world, is also dependent on these few key hubs, which we're very concerned that could be disrupted. So that's the scary part. And then this is the bit where I'm going to demonstrate that emerging economies are responsible for all of that growth. It's predominantly in cities where people are consuming resources, and they're doing that actually at the moment primarily in terms of building the cities itself. So particularly in China, most of the resources which have been consumed are in order to build that city. But actually, increasingly, the important factor is what people are doing in cities, how they're spending their money, how they're choosing to live, whether they're buying cars and so on. And I have the example of China here. I won't go through the numbers, but this highlights some of the dramatic changes, and I think it's a very rough proxy, but it gives you a sense of how people are moving up in society or to at least a different function in society. So in the year 2000, only 1 in 200 families in China had access to a car within the family, and that moved up to about 13 about 4 years ago. Now, that's a tremendous increase, obviously, and it reflects the rate of growth in China, but that is also far below where we would be in Western society today. Already there's tremendous pressure on transport systems in China, for example, but they're adding thousands of cars to the roads every day. So that story would apply across air conditioning units, refrigerators. It applies not just to energy too, it applies certainly to water, and the other example I have here is on food. So whether it's China or Brazil or India, there are statistics up there that I'm going to skip for time reasons. The story is that people are eating more. Mostly that would be considered a good thing, but of course that does put more pressure on the production of global resources. In many cases, they're still consuming a lot less than we are in the West per capita in terms of their calorie intake. But they're also switching to meat. And one of the reasons we're concerned as a sort of global population that people are switching to meat is that it's massively water intensive. So it comes back to the story I was mentioning earlier. It's hugely water intensive. It also is closely related to forest clearance and a whole range of other environmental issues, which often come back to climate change. So these shifts that we're seeing in incomes, in lifestyle, people living in larger houses, if you go back to energy, are having an absolutely profound global effect. But at home is probably where those effects are most acute. And this is just a map showing some of the cities with the most serious air quality issue concerns, which are focused in Asia, and certainly around the emerging economies, where a lot of this growth is happening, as I've just shown. But you could show something similar and show pressures on water. Actually, I have a similar map for water here, showing major cities with water stress. But you could show something similar for waste issues or a whole host of other environmental challenges. So it's really, I suppose, the centre of growth, what is reforming these or transforming these global systems, is also where it's coming back to roost. Clearly, there are a number of responses which we are taking in the West to address the amount of resources we consume. I'd argue that probably emerging economies are where some of the most ambitious efforts are to address those challenges because they're so acute. But there's a lot more to do. The points I really want to focus on is, A, what I said right at the beginning, this is part of a global story. So while it's true that the tremendous rise in growth in the emerging economies is contributing to extreme environmental pressure in some parts, that's partly in response to meeting the needs of our growth, the goods that we buy over here. So about 6%, for example, of China's greenhouse gas emissions are actually for exports. That 6% is about the equivalent of Germany, France, and the UK put together, to put that in perspective. So a huge amount of it is actually in order to meet global needs. And also, of course, this story is not necessarily negative. I mean, there's 250 million people. Different numbers are banded around, but a very large number of people moved out of extreme poverty in China in the last 20 years. So it's not sensible to put a totally negative spin on this story, and I wouldn't want to. Which was my first point on this slide, in fact. The last point, I think, is also important. The pressure which middle-class growth has put on the system, if you like, is also going to be part of the same mechanism to bring it back. Just as in the Western countries, certainly from the 50s onwards, and particularly in the 70s onwards, middle classes were really the key mobilizing force in order to address environmental challenges. That is now happening in the emerging economies too. And so, this is what we can expect over the next few years. And I think the really classic story at the moment is what is happening around the politics of air pollution in Beijing, which is really putting tremendous pressure on the government, and the government is responding by trying to close down as much as possible of the inefficient coal plant near Beijing to reduce the impacts. So that kind of dynamic, I think, is something that gives everybody some cause for hope. And with that, if anybody is interested in seeing more of these maps, more of the data, more examples, and more substantiation of some of the quite bold claims I've made, then this is the place to find it. We have quite a thick report and also an interactive website, which should be fun to play with.
So, Felix, two quick questions, and then let's open it up to the floor. So first, you said one point that some of the most ambitious attempts to really tackle the pressure on natural resources are coming from some of these emerging economies. And you just gave, I don't know if this example about air pollution in China was one of those you had in mind. Do you have another one you could maybe talk us through quickly?
That's what's happened in the last 6 months, and there's, in a way, we don't quite know how that one's going to play out, but only that it's changing everybody's sort of future energy scenarios. Over the last 5 to 10 years, I think the big example is China still, and China has 2 or 3 major policies which have really started to improve efficiency in admittedly what is currently a very inefficient industrial system in China. The first sort of brute force one of those is called the 1,000 Industries Programme. And that was basically calling up the CEOs of 1,000 or roughly 1,000 very big energy and resource consuming firms and telling them that it better do something. That was followed, or in parallel with that, provincial leaders in China were expected to implement targets on what they call energy intensity improvements, which is an improvement in the proportion or the amount of energy that you use in order to produce one unit of GDP. What that meant is the political system is now oriented, so at least a share of their performance. GDP is obviously a big part of the way the official performance is measured, but the energy component matters more, and it will probably gradually increase over time. that has led to a dramatic improvement in energy efficiency across a whole range of sectors. There's still a long way to go, but arguably by 2020 a lot of China's industries will be world-class, partly because they're building new stuff and new stuff tends to be better, but also because they're wiping out a lot of the old stuff.
Great. The second question quickly.
Yeah.
So we've heard quite a bit tonight about the about wealth, poverty and inequality in the UK, to some extent in the US, now the emerging economies. I don't know if you can give a sort of quick sense of your take about the optimism about the growth of the middle classes in the rest of the world, including in some of the poorest countries in sub-Saharan Africa. We hear a growing number of reports about, we're quite optimistic about the changing class structure in those countries too. What's your sense of that?
It's difficult to comment across lots of different countries, but we are doing some work in Ethiopia, which you're an expert in too. But what we're actually trying to do is encourage cooperation between Ethiopia and other emerging economies, starting with China, but opening that up to Turkey and a whole host of others. So we're trying to harness the optimism I was talking about and the expertise and skills which are being developed elsewhere in the world and tie that up with other parts of the world. But the extent to which those countries feature in this kind of analysis, what they represent in a sense is the next wave. So for us, and what we've been arguing with, making the case for with governments in the last year, we have a set of about 15 countries where we can see tremendous growth happening. They include countries like Vietnam and Iran, for example. Tremendous growth is already happening, and they're at the bottom edge of this curve. And of course things can go wrong, but assuming that happens, it's very important to start early to plan for some of these solutions. If they do that, I think it's quite a positive story. Otherwise, a lot of countries are going to be in a situation where they're in very poor air quality, as it is in Addis Ababa, very water scarce, and so on.